was 1942. Elie Wiesel, the noted Jewish thinker and writer, was 14 years old. He was living with his family in a small Romanian village when the Nazis came. They deported from that small Romanian village several Jewish families and individuals, loaded them on boxcars, and took them away. No one really knew what was happening, and no one knew what would happen to those who had been deported. But then, as Elie Wiesel would write later in his notable book, Night, Moishi returned. Moishi had escaped. And here is what Elie Wiesel writes they learned. He told us what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border and once in Polish territory had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto waiting trucks. The trucks headed toward a forest. There everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they'd finished their work, the men from Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot the prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. That began, as you so well know, that which has been called the Holocaust, where Nazi Germany exterminated 6 million Jews and 5 million other ethnics. A year later, Elie Wiesel himself would be sent to Auschwitz with his family, and he would watch his father work and starve to death. He said the common refrain in the concentration camps among the Jews was, "Where is God while we suffer?" Fast forward to 2010. A major earthquake strikes Haiti. And when all is said and done, somewhere between 160,000 and 300,000 people die. And that already poor country is devastated even more economically. Or go to December the 10th, 2012. Adam Lanza, after killing his mother, goes to Sandy Hook Elementary School, blasts his way in, and brutally massacres 20 first graders and 6 staff members. Where is God in the midst of all this suffering? Susan Jacoby of the Washington Post puts it this way: there's no way to reconcile senseless suffering, whether caused by man or by nature, with belief in an all-powerful, benevolent deity. It's the theodicy problem, justifying and explaining the way of God. How does one explain the inexplicable or justify the unjustifiable? What about God in the midst of the great sufferings of life? Let me speak to that. First of all, we have to accept that God allows suffering. Biblically and theologically and spiritually, you and I must accept that God allows suffering, even horrific suffering. The classic theological formula for this is this: either God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, and omniscient, meaning all-knowing, or he is not. Let that sink in. Either God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing, or he is not. And if he is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing, then there is nothing that happens that is outside his control and his desire. If God is omnipotent, and if God is all-knowing, and we believe that he is, then there is nothing that happens outside his control or his desire. Thus, if there is suffering, God allows it. If God is omnipotent, if God is omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing, there is nothing that happens in our lives or in this world that is outside his control. Thus, suffering, horrific suffering even, is allowed by God. That's the issue Job had. That's why Job wanted to argue his case before God. Because Job could not fathom how a supposedly loving God would allow such unfair suffering upon someone who was so innocent. And so Job said, "Today also my complaint is bitter," meaning his complaint to God. "His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might even come to his dwelling. I would lay my case before God and fill my mouth with arguments of how unfair this is." But the bottom line remains that we must accept that God allows all suffering. Second thing, we need to let people ask their hard questions, their heartfelt questions in times of suffering. I've said before, and I'll say it again, that we do the Christian faith no favors and we do God no good when we do not allow people to ask the hard questions in times of suffering, in particular the question why. I've stated that many times, but I need to state it again. We do not help ourselves. We do not help the witness of the Christian faith, and we do not help the witness of God when we do not let human beings ask the very real question why when they're going through great suffering. I put it this way in one of my devotionals: telling a parent whose young child suffers from brutal cancer that he or she can never ask why is not reasonable. Telling the parents and families in Newtown, Connecticut who lost their children at Sandy Hook Elementary School that they could not question God makes no sense. Telling a young mother who is battling a terminal illness and faces the prospects of leaving her young children behind that she should never say why is not reasonable. Telling someone stricken with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, in the prime of his or her life never to ask why makes no sense. You see, God can handle that. God can handle our questions. God is not offended by our honesty. God is not offended even by those who would dare, as Job, to ask the very real question, why God? How God? Where are you, God, in the midst of great suffering? He made us this way. He made us as human beings who can think and reflect and feel. Why would God make us this way if He wanted to shut it off? If He wouldn't allow you to be human or me to be human? And so we have to be very careful that we do not send the message to people when they're going through great suffering that they cannot ask the hard questions, even the hard questions of God. Because I guarantee you, God can handle the questions. We're the ones who are having trouble handling the questions. But God can handle it. Third thing, God allowing suffering does not mean that He causes it. This is very important. God allowing suffering does not mean that He causes it. There are people, and I say this as kindly as I can, who believe that God brings particular suffering on particular people at particular times for particular reasons. There are Christians who believe that when suffering occurs in someone's life, God has brought that particular suffering on that particular person at this particular time for a particular reason. And I learned very early in my ministry that there are people who feel that way, who feel like when suffering comes, God has done something to them. I've shared before the story of the young couple that Pat and I knew in my first full-time appointment many years ago who couldn't wait to have their first child. They had longed for that moment when they would get the news that Karen was going to be pregnant. And they got the news. Pat and I visited with them and celebrated with them the wonderful news that their boy would be born. And he was born. But shortly after he was born, it was discovered that he had a congenital heart defect and that he would, by the time he was a year old, require open heart surgery, which they did. I was at Methodist Central when that surgery took place, sitting with them. I was there when the doctor walked through the doors that came from the surgery area. I could see the look on his face. I was there when he put his arms around Don and Karen and said, he didn't make it. I saw the tears. I heard the wailing. I saw their anguish And I will not to this day forget what Karen said. Why did God do this to us? Why did God take our son? Well, he didn't. God didn't take their son. And he didn't do that to them or to him. Yes, life did. Yes, the physical condition did. But God didn't. How do I know that? Because Jesus said so. Because Jesus said that the sun rises on the just and the unjust alike. The sun rises on good folk and bad folk. And the rain, the difficulties, come to the righteous and the unrighteous alike. In other words, good things happen to bad people, even as good things happen to good people. And bad things happen to good people just like bad things happen to bad people. Jesus said the good things happen on everybody and the bad things happen to everybody. One contemporary translation of that puts it like this: understand that the Father allows both good and bad in our lives. In God's way of things, good can come to those who deserve it and those who don't. And unfortunate things can come to both those who don't deserve it and those who do. I hope you can understand that if there's suffering in your life or in the life of somebody you love and about whom you care, God did not bring that particular suffering on that particular person or you for any particular reason. He allowed it, but he didn't cause it. Fourth thing, we must acknowledge our limited understanding. I said that last week. I want to expound on it today. We finite human beings cannot comprehend the infinite. We can rant and rail all day long. We can yearn for the answer from God. We can seek explanation like Job did for why things were happening in his life. But the bottom line is, we cannot comprehend the incomprehensible. We finite cannot comprehend the infinite. We regular human beings cannot understand that which is majestic and mysterious and miraculous. The book of Job, for 37 chapters, has this conversation going on about suffering. Job with his friends, and then Job with God, Job pressing God for answers. And then the 38th through the 41st chapters of the book of Job are God's response to Job. Listen to this. Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? This is God to Job. Where were you when I created the earth? Tell me, since you know so much. Who decided on its size? Certainly you know that. Who came up with the blueprints and measurements? How was its foundation poured? And who set the cornerstone? Was that you, Job? Or was that me? In other words, God's response to Job is, I understand the question. I'm glad for you to ask the question, but Job, there is not an answer that you in your finite state can understand at all. For I am the Lord God of creation. I am the Lord God of the universe. I brought everything into being. I set the boundaries of existence. And there is no way you can possibly understand why I do what I do and why things are the way they are. You cannot. Will we ever know? Will we ever have an explanation that makes sense to us as to why God does things the way he does? Yes. Beyond this life. The answer will come. And here's what I want to tell you. The answer God gives to you and me beyond this life about suffering will make all the sense then that it cannot make now. In the end, I have absolute trust that God's way of doing things makes all the sense in the world. It's just you and I can't understand it. And finally this, God does not leave us alone in our suffering. And you know that. Did you know that Steve Hayner died Saturday a week ago? If I ask you to raise your hand if you know Steve Hayner, I doubt there's anybody in this sanctuary, or very few at least, who knows Steve Hayner. Steve Hayner was president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for many years. It's the most noted evangelical campus ministry in our country, highly respected. He later became president of Columbia Theological Seminary, highly respected. Last year, Steve Hayner learned that he had pancreatic cancer. Saturday a week ago at age 66, he died. 2 weeks before he died, Steve Hayner wrote in his blog these words. Listen carefully. Because we know who's in charge of the circumstances, we can find joy even in the difficulties. Love embraces me. Joy uplifts me. Gratitude settles me. Eternity surrounds me. And God's grace upholds me. Wow. Wow. That's it. Love embraces me. Joy uplifts me. Gratitude settles me. Eternity surrounds us. And God's grace upholds us. Whatever you face, there will be strength beyond your strength. There will be power beyond your power. There will be hope beyond your hope, because the Lord God of history is working in the circumstances of your life, comforting and sustaining and enabling. Strength you can't imagine. Power you can't believe. Hope you didn't know you could have, because eternity surrounds you and God's grace upholds you, whatever the suffering that you face. So what about God and suffering? We need to accept it. God allows all suffering. But we also need to feel free to ask the honest, hard question. Why do you allow it? Why, oh God, do you let this happen? We need to understand that God allows but does not cause. He allows the suffering that we know, but He's not causing that suffering in your life or the lives of those you know. We just have to acknowledge we can't understand it. We cannot comprehend it. We're the finite. He's the infinite. But whatever you face, you're not alone. The Lord God walks with you, as with me, every step of the way, of every moment of our suffering. And His grace upholds us, doesn't it? Thanks be to God.